Something is seriously off in Cleveland, and the deeper you look, the harder it becomes to believe this was just another bad football decision. What's unfolding right now feels less like a normal quarterback miss and more like the quiet collapse of trust between a franchise, the media that covers it, and the fans who were told a very specific story. For months, the Cleveland Browns quarterback situation was framed as thoughtful, calculated, and responsible. But now, with hindsight cutting through the noise, cracks are forming everywhere. And those cracks are exposing things many people would rather keep buried. Because this isn't just about a young quarterback struggling on Sundays. It's not simply about scouting errors or growing pains. What's starting to surface is a trail of selective narratives, exaggerated controversies, and conveniently timed silence that raises uncomfortable questions about how public opinion is shaped long before a single snap is played. Fans are beginning to ask whether the story they were sold was ever the full truth, or whether it was carefully managed from the start. For a long time, anyone who pushed back was brushed off. You were told to trust the process. You were told certain players just weren't ready, that concerns were legitimate, that doubts were organic. But now, some of the same voices who confidently sold those narratives are quietly changing their tone. And when people start admitting they knew things privately but chose not to say them publicly, that's when everything changes. Because once that door opens, it forces a bigger question into the spotlight. If doubts existed all along, why weren't fans told the full story when it actually mattered? Why were certain flaws magnified while others were softened or ignored entirely? And why does it feel like one player was scrutinized under a microscope while another was protected by silence? What makes this situation even more unsettling is that none of this is coming from wild internet theories alone. It's coming from statements, reversals, and quiet admissions that are now impossible to ignore. The kind that only surface after decisions fail. The kind that make you wonder whether media coverage is always about evaluation or sometimes about steering perception. And once you start connecting those dots, the Browns quarterback saga stops looking random. It starts looking orchestrated. Not necessarily through secret meetings or backroom deals, but through repetition, framing, and the power of who chooses what gets amplified and what quietly disappears. So before you write this off as another failed rebuild or chalk it up to bad luck, take a moment, because what you're about to hear isn't about hindsight takes or piling on a struggling player. It's about how narratives are built, how reputations are shaped, and how easily the line between analysis and agenda can blur, especially when powerful voices all seem to move in the same direction at the same time. And once you see it, it becomes impossible to unsee. The shift didn't happen slowly. It wasn't subtle. One week, Shedeur Sanders was being discussed as one of the most intriguing quarterback prospects in the country. His poise, production, and leadership were part of the conversation. Then, almost overnight, the tone changed. Not because of film, not because of a poor performance, but because a new narrative suddenly began taking over the airwaves.
Instead of breakdowns of his footwork or discussions about his processing speed, the focus drifted elsewhere. Conversations became centered on questions rather than traits. Vague concerns started popping up without clear sourcing. Phrases like, "people around the league are wondering," or "there's been some talk behind the scenes," were repeated again and again, rarely followed by anything concrete. And the more those phrases were echoed, the more real they started to sound to the audience. What made this noticeable wasn't just the criticism itself, it was how quickly it spread. Multiple outlets began hitting the same talking points at the same time. Different shows, different hosts, same conclusions. To fans paying close attention, it felt less like independent evaluation and more like a script everyone had suddenly agreed to read from. Not because anyone proved anything new, but because repetition has a way of turning speculation into assumed truth. And the timing mattered. This wasn't happening deep into the season or after a major setback. It was happening right as draft conversations were heating up, when perception carries almost as much weight as performance. when a prospect's reputation can rise or fall based on the way stories are framed, not just what actually happened on the field. What stood out even more was what wasn't being discussed. The strength that once defined the conversation, his composure under pressure, his command of the offense, his ability to elevate teammates, began fading from coverage. Not challenged, not disproven, just quietly pushed aside. In their place came broad, hard-to-pin-down concerns that were difficult to refute precisely because they were never clearly defined. For a lot of fans, that's when the questions started. Not about Shedeur's ability, but about the sudden urgency to reframe who he was. Why now? Why this aggressively? And why did so many voices seem so confident about issues they struggled to explain in detail? Because when a narrative appears this fast, this coordinated, and this detached from on-field evidence, it stops feeling organic. It starts feeling intentional. And as that storyline gained momentum, it set the stage for one moment that would completely expose how uneven the coverage really was. The moment that truly ignited everything wasn't a bad throw, a shaky performance, or a questionable decision on the field. It was a speeding ticket, a routine traffic stop that under normal circumstances barely registers as news at all. Yet in this case, it somehow became the centerpiece of the conversation, and the way it was handled raised eyebrows almost immediately. Reports started circulating that Shedeur Sanders had been pulled over for driving above the speed limit. No injuries, no arrests, no reckless endangerment, just a citation, the kind thousands of people receive every single day. Yet the reaction from certain corners of the media was anything but routine. The story didn't pass through the news cycle, it dominated it. Segment after segment began dissecting what the ticket supposedly revealed about Shedeur as a person. Suddenly, it wasn't about traffic laws anymore. It was framed as a referendum on maturity, on responsibility, on whether he could be trusted to lead an NFL locker room. Commentators spoke with an intensity that made it sound like a minor infraction was evidence of something far more serious. What stood out wasn't that the incident was mentioned, it was how relentlessly it was revisited. The same talking points resurfaced day after day. Different platforms echoed the same conclusions. The story was stretched, analyzed, and reanalyzed until it took on a weight that felt wildly disproportionate to the actual event. And with every retelling, the implications grew heavier. For fans watching this unfold, the reaction felt strange. Not because athletes should be immune from criticism, but because this level of scrutiny is usually reserved for major off-field incidents. Yet here, a basic traffic violation was being framed as a character flaw, almost as if it were proof of some deeper issue that no one could quite define, but everyone seemed eager to suggest. And that eagerness mattered, because once a narrative like that takes hold, it becomes self-reinforcing. The more it's discussed, the more legitimate it appears. The more legitimate it appears, the easier it becomes to justify doubt. And before long, a speeding ticket stops being a footnote and starts being treated like a warning sign. But what really caused fans to stop and reassess wasn't the coverage itself, it was what happened shortly afterward, when a nearly identical situation involving a different player produced a completely different reaction. Not long after the Shedeur Sanders story had been run into the ground, something else happened, and for a lot of fans, this was the moment everything clicked. Cleveland Browns defensive star Myles Garrett was also pulled over for speeding. Same type of situation, same kind of traffic violation. Public record, no mystery, no dispute about what happened. But the reaction couldn't have been more different. Instead of wall-to-wall coverage, the story barely made a ripple. There were no marathon segments breaking down what the ticket said about Garrett's leadership, no extended debates about whether it revealed a lack of maturity or decision-making issues, no urgent concern about whether he could be trusted as the face of the franchise. In fact, many fans didn't even realize it happened unless they went looking for it. The contrast was impossible to miss. Two similar incidents, two wildly different responses. One was treated like a defining character moment, The other was mentioned briefly, if at all, and then quietly moved on from. And that disparity wasn't subtle, it was glaring. That's when the conversation shifted from football to credibility. Because if a speeding ticket is truly a reflection of character, shouldn't that standard apply evenly? Shouldn't leadership concerns be raised across the board? Or does the meaning of an incident change depending on who's involved and what narrative already surrounds them? Fans weren't asking for Garrett to be dragged, they were asking for consistency. They wanted to know why one player's mistake became a talking point for weeks, while another's was effectively dismissed as a non-issue. And when no clear explanation was offered, speculation filled the gap. To many observers, it began to feel like the coverage wasn't driven by the severity of the action, but by how useful the story was. Useful for reinforcing a pre-existing storyline. Useful for validating doubts that had already been planted. Useful for shaping perception rather than simply reporting events. And once people started viewing it through that lens, it became harder to ignore what else was being selectively highlighted or quietly left out. Because while one narrative was being amplified, another side of the story was barely being told at all. While certain stories were being amplified again and again, others were quietly slipping through the cracks. And these weren't rumors or vague talking points. They were real moments that, under different circumstances, would have been highlighted as proof of leadership and character. During that same stretch of intense scrutiny, Shedeur Sanders was spending time in communities that rarely get attention, visiting schools, speaking directly to students, showing up in neighborhoods where kids don't often see successful athletes taking the time to engage with them one-on-one. There were no flashy announcements, no media tours. In many cases, these moments only surfaced through small local posts or word of mouth. What made this noticeable wasn't that every good deed didn't make headlines. That's normal. It was how little space these stories occupied compared to how much airtime was given to a single traffic violation. Acts that could have added balance to the conversation were barely acknowledged, if they were mentioned at all. And balance matters, because when coverage focuses almost entirely on negative framing, it creates an incomplete picture. Viewers weren't being shown a full snapshot of who Shedeur was off the field. They were being shown a narrow slice, carefully shaped by what was emphasized and what was ignored. Supporters began pointing this out. They noticed that community work, mentorship, and genuine outreach didn't seem to fit the version of Shedeur that was being presented on air. Highlighting those moments would have complicated the narrative. It would have forced a more nuanced conversation, one that didn't align neatly with the doubts being pushed. So instead, those stories stayed small. They weren't denied, they just weren't elevated. And in media, that distinction is important, because what you choose not to highlight can be just as influential as what you put front and center. As more people became aware of this imbalance, the discussion moved beyond football decisions. It started touching on why certain players are framed the way they are, and why confidence, visibility, and independence can sometimes be interpreted very differently depending on who's displaying them. As the coverage continued to tilt in one direction, a different conversation started bubbling up online and among fans. It wasn't coming from official reports or on-the-record statements. It was coming from observation, from patterns, from the feeling that something deeper than football evaluation was influencing how Shedeur Sanders was being portrayed. Some supporters began to speculate that Shedeur made certain people uncomfortable, not because of what he couldn't do, but because of what he represented. His confidence, his visibility, his refusal to shrink himself to fit a mold. He didn't speak like a quarterback trying to win over gatekeepers. He spoke like someone who already knew who he was. There's been a lot of buzz suggesting that athletes who don't follow the traditional script often face a different kind of scrutiny. And in Shedeur's case, that scrutiny seemed to intensify precisely because he didn't appear interested in performing humility on demand. He didn't constantly seek validation from media voices. He didn't adjust his personality to make others feel more comfortable. Some fans also pointed to his background, the fact that he came from a high-profile family,
that he already had a platform, that he didn't need access granted by local media to be heard. Reports have claimed that this independence can quietly shift dynamics, especially in markets where access is currency. When a player doesn't rely on traditional channels, it challenges the usual balance of power. Race also became part of the discussion, carefully but unavoidably. Supporters argued that confident black quarterbacks are often judged through a harsher lens, with behaviors framed as cocky rather than competitive, or immature rather than passionate. To be clear, this wasn't being presented as proven intent, it was being raised as a pattern people have seen before, and one they felt was playing out again. What fueled this speculation even more was the contrast in expectations. Shedeur was constantly asked to prove his leadership, his maturity, his character, often without a clear explanation of what he was lacking. Meanwhile, others seemed to benefit from the assumption that those traits were already there. Whether intentional or not, the result was the same: a narrative that painted confidence as a red flag, independence as a problem, and success as something that needed to be constantly justified. And as this framing took hold, it made the Browns' eventual decision feel less surprising, but far more troubling in hindsight. When draft day finally arrived, the Browns made their choice. Despite months of conversation, debate, and speculation, Shedeur Sanders was no longer part of their plans. Cleveland went in a different direction, passing on him entirely and signaling that whatever concerns had been circulating carried real weight inside the organization. Instead, the Browns placed their bet on another option, Dillon Gabriel. Taken later in the draft, he was quickly framed as a smart, developmental solution, a quarterback who fit the system, a player the organization believed it could mold. Public messaging shifted almost instantly, with emphasis on patience, upside, and long-term vision. The team didn't just draft Gabriel, they committed to him. Coaches spoke confidently. Media availability leaned optimistic. The language used around him was careful and protective, focused on growth rather than pressure. Every organization wants its picks to succeed, but in this case, the effort to sell belief was especially noticeable. And that belief wasn't limited to football strategy. It was about optics, about signaling stability, about reinforcing the idea that the Browns had made a responsible, well-reasoned decision. In doing so, the organization appeared to fully embrace the narrative that had been building for months, that passing on Shedeur was the safer move. What made this choice stand out was how quickly certainty replaced doubt. Questions that once dominated conversations about other prospects seemed to disappear. The benefit of the doubt was extended freely. Development was emphasized over immediate results, and for a while that messaging held. But optimism only lasts as long as performance allows it to, and once the season began, the gap between expectation and reality started to show. Fast. Once the game started, the tone shifted almost immediately. What had been framed as a patient development plan began to look more like a gamble that wasn't paying off. Drive after drive, the offense struggled to find rhythm, momentum stalled, opportunities slipped away, and with each passing week it became harder to explain what fans were seeing on the field. The Browns' offense didn't just struggle, it looked disconnected. Sustaining drives became a challenge, third downs felt almost automatic for the opposing defense, scoring chances were rare, and when they did appear, they often fizzled out before turning into anything meaningful. It wasn't about one bad game, it was the sameness of it all, the patterns repeated. As losses mounted, the language around Dillon Gabriel began to change, the optimism softened, the patience thinned. Phrases that once emphasized upside were quietly replaced with concerns about readiness, and the same outlets that had once urged fans to trust the plan began acknowledging what viewers had been saying for weeks, that the product on the field was becoming difficult to watch. What made this moment so revealing was how fast the narrative flipped. The grace period vanished, developmental context disappeared. Suddenly, the standard shifted from long-term potential to immediate accountability, and for many fans, that contrast raised new questions about how quickly the benefit of the doubt can be withdrawn once a storyline stops working. The frustration wasn't just about results, it was about honesty. Fans weren't angry that a young quarterback struggled. They were frustrated that they had been assured this outcome was unlikely, that concerns were overblown, that this was the right move. And as that frustration boiled over, something else began happening behind the scenes. Voices that had once spoken confidently started choosing their words more carefully, and then, quietly at first, came the admissions that would change everything. As the losses piled up and frustration reached a breaking point, something unexpected started happening. The conversation shifted, not because of a bold investigation or a breaking report, but because of what people began admitting after the fact, almost casually, almost as if they didn't realize how revealing their words actually were. Media figures who had once spoken with certainty began offering a different version of events. They didn't fully reverse their positions, but they added qualifiers, hints, statements about concerns they'd supposedly had earlier, doubts they claimed to have expressed privately. And for many fans, that's when alarm bells went off. Because these admissions didn't come with accountability, they came with distance. The implication was that the warning signs had always been there, but that somehow no one felt compelled to make them public when they could have mattered most. When draft decisions were still being debated, when expectations were still being set. Some commentators acknowledged that they'd seen issues during training camp, that they'd questioned readiness behind closed doors, that they'd felt uneasy about what was coming. But those concerns hadn't been reflected in the coverage fans were consuming at the time. Publicly, the messaging remained calm, confident, reassuring. And that disconnect is what raised eyebrows. Because if skepticism existed, why wasn't it part of the conversation? Why were audiences guided towards certainty instead of caution? Why were doubts treated as whispers instead of warnings? To many viewers, it felt like a quiet rewriting of history, an attempt to soften responsibility after the outcome was already clear. And once people started noticing that pattern, it became impossible to ignore how selectively truth seemed to surface, only after the narrative had collapsed. At that point, the story stopped being about one quarterback or one season. It became about influence, about who shapes perception, and about how easily narratives can be protected until reality forces them into the open. When you step back and look at the full picture, this story stops being about wins, losses, or even quarterbacks. It becomes a case study in how much power narratives really hold in modern sports, and how rarely that power is questioned until something goes wrong. Sports media doesn't just report outcomes, it frames expectations. It decides which concerns deserve oxygen and which stories quietly fade away. And when enough voices move in the same direction at the same time, that framing can feel indistinguishable from truth until reality interrupts it. What makes this situation uncomfortable isn't that mistakes were made. Mistakes happen in every organization. What lingers is the realization that some doubts were apparently known but not shared, that certainty was projected publicly while hesitation lived privately, and that fans were asked to trust a process without ever seeing the full conversation behind it. That doesn't automatically mean there was a grand scheme or a single mastermind pulling strings, but it does raise serious questions about incentive, access, and influence, about whether maintaining relationships sometimes takes priority over challenging narratives, and about how easily confidence can be manufactured through repetition rather than evidence. For fans, the takeaway isn't to reject everything they hear, but to listen more critically, to notice patterns, to ask why certain stories explode while others barely register. Because credibility isn't just about being right in hindsight, it's about being honest when it's uncomfortable. And as this situation continues to play out, one thing is clear. Once trust is shaken, it's hard to rebuild. The audience remembers who spoke loudly and who stayed silent. And whether this becomes a turning point or just another forgotten controversy will depend on how much accountability follows. Because in the end, the most powerful thing in sports isn't a headline or a hot take. It's the truth. And sooner or later, it always finds its way to the surface.